That's right. In today's video, we've got our gloves on, we're ditching the spool, and we're talking about resin printing. Now, this is actually the first time I'm talking about resin printers on this channel. As you know, while I do currently have 7 3D printers, they're all FDM based. That means they feed filament, whereas a resin printer uses resin. Now, while a resin printer is something I've been wanting to play with for a while now, it hasn't really been something that I could really justify. Most of my printing involves practical stuff, 3D printer parts, larger things. I don't really have a demand for a resin printer that could justify me going out and getting one, but I have wanted to try one for a bit now. So I reached out to my contact at Banggood to send me over a unit for testing and evaluation. And this is the model I received. It's an Anycubic Photon Mono. It has a print volume of 130 millimeters by 80 millimeters by approximately 165 millimeters tall. It is an entry-level resin printer. It comes in at around $200 US, and it has the newer mono type display. What a mono screen means is it will have the ability to print faster, and it should have a longer usability life compared to the older style of screens in resin printers. Now, I did unbox this unit and get it set up on a recent live stream, and if you missed that live stream, make sure you are subscribed to the channel and ring that bell so you don't miss any ones in the future. Setting up this machine was extremely straightforward. You essentially just take it out of the box, remove the packaging, put the print bed on the Z-axis, loosen 4 screws. You home the printer with a piece of paper on the screen. You tighten up the 4 screws, move the Z-axis up, install your vat, pour some resin in, put the cover on, and print. Now, we did run into a little bit of a hang-up though. Unfortunately, the unit that I received didn't come with a USB card or an SD card. I guess that is a thing moving forward due to customs. They don't come with one. So I did run into a little bit of a hiccup where I had to download a slicer for the first time. I haven't sliced anything with a resin printer before. I haven't watched any tutorials, but we did get a print going. And honestly, the very first print out of this blows anything I've done on an FDM printer in terms of sheer quality away. And yeah, I'm kind of happy I have one of these now. Now, after that live stream though, I did go on YouTube and I did watch several videos, spent a couple hours learning some ins and outs of resin printing and how to slice properly. I am going to give a shout out to 3D Printing Pro. He has a bunch of excellent videos on how to slice models in Anycubic, which is the slicer I ended up going with. So after that initial hiccup and a crash course on how to properly run a resin printer, I went ahead and I started printing stuff. Now, the second model I printed after that initial test print was this Skull of Gul'dan by Willow, and you can find this model on thangs.com. Now, when it comes to resin printing, and this was the first thing I noticed, with a FDM 3D printer, your slicers have many settings that you can go in to tweak and adjust. However, once you have a profile that you know works, you can pretty much import most models and just hit slice and print. A resin printer slicer has a lot less settings. However, when you import your model, you're going to have to do a lot of tweaking and tuning, especially when it comes to supports, before you go and actually slice it and go to print it. Now, with this model, I was lucky it came pre-supported, and since this was the second model I'm printing, I printed it with its built-in supports, and it printed well. And again, I am blown away with the quality on this machine. Now, the next model I printed was this Mandalorian model. Now, this model needed supports, and again, thanks to 3D Printing Pro's excellent tutorial on how to set up supports in Anycubic, it came out great. Now, with resin printers, when it comes to supports, there's all kinds of rules that you have to follow. You have to ensure things are properly supported. It's not like an FDM printer where you can kind of fudge and skip supports in certain areas. With a resin printer, if you don't have things properly supported, and you're definitely going to end up with failed prints further down the line. So you really need to ensure and take the time to go through and ensure everything is properly supported with a resin print before you even hit slice. Now, most slicers do have the ability to auto-generate supports. However, you can't always rely on them. So you're always going to have to go in there and double check your settings to ensure that your model is correctly supported. And the last model I printed in the Tech Fast Gray was this Fantasy Castle, and this was scaled to pretty much the maximum size that I could fit on this printer. Again, it is a relatively small volume. Now, I did run into an issue though, and as you can see, half of it looks like it has snow on it, but that comes down to an error that I made during processing the prints. And processing the prints is a downside and definitely a drawback compared to traditional FDM 3D printing. Now, the safety precautions and the post-processing are going to be the two biggest differences between resin printing and traditional FDM printing when it comes to the prep and afterwork of a completed print. Now, the safety precautions are relatively easy to work with. Whenever you're handling raw resin, you're going to want to be wearing gloves. Some resins release noxious fumes and smells, so you probably are going to want to wear a mask of some sort. And when the printer is running and when you are curing it, you do have the potential for UV light exposure. So you're going to want to use any protective shields that come with the equipment. So I was kind of lucky when I mentioned that I was getting a resin printer. Somebody on the Voron Discord mentioned that, hey, I have an extra wash and cure station. It's an older model, but it checks out. So he was generous enough to sell that to me at a nice little discount for an older model, but it was new in the box. And honestly, if you are going to get into resin printing, you can't avoid using a wash and cure station if you manually wash your prints and cure them outside in a sunny day. However, if this is something you're really going to want to get into, you definitely do want to get a wash and cure station. It just makes everything so much easier. However, they do cost money. So you are going to have to factor that into your initial cost for setting up for resin printing. So I ended up settling into a nice routine to post-process my prints after they were finished printing. What I would do is either let them drip normally, or depending on the model, I would put them on this 45-degree hanger that I printed and let any excess resin drip off. And then I would take the prints, dunk it in the isobas off the hanger along with the bed, and run the cleaning cycle. This ensures that the bed itself is clean of any excess resin and the model itself is clean. After it's washed in the ISO, I remove the print from the bed. I go ahead and clean up and remove any supports. On some models, I did run it through another ISO wash in the basket at this point, and then other models, depending on how clean they were, how clean the supports came off, I simply removed right onto our next step, which was curing it. And for curing it, you put it in the wash and cure station, set it to the cure cycle, and expose it to UV light. Depending on the size of the model, 1 cycle, 2 cycles. I'm still getting the hang of it. I'm sure different types of resin is going to need different amount of cure, and how thick the model is as well is going to affect its curing. Compared to a traditional FDM printer, where most prints you can just pop off the bed and they're good to go, and sometimes you may have to break off some supports, there definitely is a much more laborious process to finishing up these prints. But it's definitely not all downsides. And as you can see here, from this Spriggan model from Skyrim that I printed, you are able to pull off details that most FDM printers will struggle and cry to reproduce. There really is no tuning with a resin printer. You are going to have to adjust things such as the layer time and exposure and your Z speed, but really there's no flow to worry about. There's no accelerations to worry about. Once you find a profile that works with a resin, it just works. You slice something and you let it go. When you start a print, unfortunately, with a resin, you do have this vat here. Most resins are not really see-through, and you have an aluminum plate in the way. So you really can't check to make sure your first layer and everything's sticking to the bed quite well right off the start. What I would do is let the print go 30 to 50 layers, pause the print, the bed would rise up out of the resin, and I could check to make sure that everything was proceeding okay, and then hit resume. Layer lines, you're printing at 0.05 millimeters. Layer lines are almost invisible. Your XY resolution is going to beat the snot out of any 0.4 millimeter nozzle any day. You're not going to have to worry about things such as seams, bulging on corners with acceleration. Your prints are just going to come out really, really clean. Now, another major advantage of a resin printer is its speed. Now, of course, you're not going to be whipping around a tool head at 300 millimeters a second like on a traditional FDM printer like a Voron. However, with a resin printer, it does the whole layer all at once. And how it works with this is with resin, it reacts to UV light. So you have a screen at the bottom. It basically flashes a negative image of the individual layer. That layer cures, bed goes up, lets some resin flow in, bed comes back down 0.05 millimeters higher, and it repeats the process. What that means is your layer time is always the same. And the big advantage of that is you can load this print bed up to as many models as you can fit. And as long as your Z height is the same with all the models, the print time is going to be the same. So just to compare with, say, this one muscular mushroom man here on a traditional 3D printer, like an Ender 3, if you print one of these, say it takes an hour. To print 2 of these, it's going to take 2 hours. To print 3 of these, it's going to take 3 hours. However, in the time it takes to print one muscular mushroom man on a resin printer, you can print 3, you can print 6. You can print as many as you fit on the bed, as long as the Z height is the same. Another advantage of resin printing is you can scale things up quicker. with a traditional FDM printer, when you take something and scale it to 200%, so your printing times don't double, they're affected by the square cube law. Think of it this way, if you have a 1 meter cube and you make that a 2 meter cube, you're not just doubling it, you're doubling on the X, you're doubling it on the Y, and you're doubling it on the Z. So you now have 8 1 meter cubes in that same volume. Now, of course, with 3D printing, there's infill, there's outer wall, so it's not exactly a straight logarithmic path. However, with a resin printer, if you double the height, you double the print time, because XY dimensions don't matter because it does the whole layer all at once. Now, speaking of infill though, with a resin printer, when it comes to printing objects, you really only have 2 options. You either print it completely solid or you print it hollow. Can't really go ahead and print with infill like you would on an FDM printer. The reason for that is you need some way for the resin to drain. Okay, if you print with infill, there's a chance liquid resin can get trapped. And if you have liquid resin trapped in a cured print, it can cause the print to crack and fail down the line. So when you go to slice your model, you're gonna have to take that into account. With smaller things, such as the Spriggan model here, or the Mandalorian, you can go ahead and just print them solid. But if you wanna print something larger, like this T-Rex skull here, there's certainly large areas that you're gonna wanna hollow out. Now, when you hollow them out, you are gonna have to go and put drain holes in. Most slicers have the ability to add these manually, and you're gonna have to add drain holes, but you're also gonna have to add vent holes. Now, as you can see here with this Fantasy Castle model that I printed, and I did print this hollow, I forgot to add a vent hole. So what this means is it was essentially printing a cup upside down for the majority of this model. That includes a portion where the model was actually above the resin, and every time it did the retraction, it acted like suction. Now, this could potentially pop the model off your bed, but in my case here, it just caused print defects. I was lucky enough. So you're gonna have to take a lot of these considerations into account when you're slicing models and prepping them for print on a resin printer. Now, let's talk about the printer itself. This is the, again, Anycubic Photon Mono. This model was provided to me from Banggood for testing and evaluation. Everything I'm saying about this printer is my own opinion, not paid or anything to say anything. And for a first resin printer, I really like it. I don't have anything to compare it to, unfortunately. This is, again, my first resin 3D printer, but the machine is dead simple. There's no XY to worry about. There's no bed to really level other than loosening 4 screws, coming down on a piece of paper and then tightening 4 screws. And it hasn't shifted level at all, even after removing the vat. Resin printers are dead simple. There's a Z-axis and a screen and a few other bits and bobs attached to it. That's it. All I've done is put a little PTFE grease on the lead screw, just to lube it up a little bit because it was bone dry out of the box. And it's got a big beefy EG15 linear rail to keep everything straight on the Z-axis, because since this is your only moving axis, you're gonna want a really rigid Z system on your resin printer. You don't want lead screw wobble on a resin printer, or any printer really. Now, there are a few critiques I can make about this machine. Quality is not one of them. The build quality itself feels very good. The print quality I'm blown away with, but again, I don't have another resin printer I can compare it to. The volume is quite small. Now, it does come in around a little over $200 US, and you can compare that to something like an Ender 3, so you can get a resin printer cheaper than most other entry-level FDM printers. However, your bed volume is quite small. Compared to the 220 by 220 of a standard Ender 3 bed, for example, the 130 by 82 millimeters is honestly puny. So don't be getting one of these and planning to print full-size Mandalorian helmets. You won't be doing that on this machine, at least in one piece. Now, 2 little nitpicks about this machine. The enclosure itself comes off over the top. There are machines where the enclosure is pretty much attached to it and you have a front door. I personally would rather have a machine like that, simply for the fact of putting this somewhere. I'm starting to run out of room in my shop down here, and I was hoping to put this under a shelf. However, now I need to put it somewhere where I have, enough overhead where I can take the lid off completely. I don't want to be, accidentally bumping a print with the lid trying to take it off. So that is something you're gonna have to take into account. If you have a limited workspace when it comes to the maximum height, you're gonna want to get a machine where you have a door. And another downside, and this is coming from somebody who runs all of their machines on Clipper and have webcams, there's really no way to remote monitor these prints. I've literally taking a webcam off one of my current printers and taping it to a stick on a post that I could sit in front of this when I watch, because there is really no way to remote monitor these. There's no web interface. There's no way to plug a Raspberry Pi up to it and use like Octoprint, for example. There's no built-in webcam. So that is something that I would really like to see on some of these machines. I haven't really looked into the higher end machines, but even those don't really have many options when it comes to it. I would love to see just a simple web interface with these machines, just so you could upload stuff to remote start a print, and maybe just you don't need a major one, but just a nice little webcam so you can at least see that the print is progressing. It is kind of old school with these machines. You have to plug in a USB thumb drive with the sliced file on it, select it on the screen, and hit print manually. There is no remote control with these machines. Now, speaking of the screen, it is a quite small touch LCD screen, but it gives you all the information you need. And actually, during the print itself, it will show a picture of the individual sliced layer that it is currently exposing to the resin. So that's kind of neat. I'm not personally a huge fan of touch screens, mostly for the fact that you have to be looking at the screen when you push something. If I'm homing a Z-axis, for example, I'd rather be looking at what's moving and pushing a button. You can accidentally touch a wrong button on a touchscreen because you have no tactile feedback. Also, this one does work with these gloves, but you're probably going to be wearing gloves a lot around this machine and constantly touching the screen. I could see it getting dirty down the line. On the side of the machine, there really isn't much. There's a USB port and a power on off. And on the back of the machine, there is a power in, and it does have a wall wart style power brick. I honestly would have preferred to see a separate one. These types of large power bricks, I'm just personally not a fan of. So those are some of my initial thoughts and impressions of a resin printer from somebody who's never played with a resin printer before. I really like the machine and I really like the prints. Now, will I be using this a lot? It depends. I could definitely see this taking over as my small models and small detailed models especially machine. I don't really, most of my 3D printers are relatively large. I do have my Voron V0 that I originally built as my small model printer, but has kind of been relegated to backup printer duties, unfortunately. So this machine will probably have a place in my workshop in the coming future. Definitely will be using it anytime a fancy new Chaos Cortec model shows up on Thangs that I'm going to want to print in high detail, because FDM and small fine details, while it does work, you're not going to approach the same quality of a resin printer. Now, would I recommend it though as a first printer? Probably not. If you are into something like Warhammer or minifigures, or you really know that you are going to be printing high quality detailed models for paint or just to collect, then yes, go to a resin printer. But if you're unsure and you really don't know what you're going to be printing, I would definitely recommend starting off with a traditional FDM filament 3D printer like the Ender 3. You're going to have much more options. There is more overlap with FDM into stuff a resin can do than what a resin printer can do that an FDM printer can do. Resin printers do have downsides in terms of print volume. Again, you're not going to be printing any full-size Iron Man helmets on any of these machines unless you spring for the multi-$1,000 large-scale resin printers that are out there, like the Piopoly Phenom L. And the post-processing and the cleanup of the prints is definitely a drawback you're going to have to take into account, especially if you're in a tight environment and around children, for example. So if your printer is going to be in, a living room or a common area and you have children in your house, resin may not be something you want to get involved with. These don't have childproof caps on them, at least the two bottles that I have here. I have some Anycubic translucent green and some Tech fast gray. So you will have to store these in a proper location out of reach of the little ones. But if you already have a traditional FDM filament printer and you're looking to branch out into something new, you want to start printing those high quality, high detail little models, definitely check out one of these machines. The entry cost of just the machine itself is very reasonable for these smaller units. There are wash and cure stations that are lower priced, and really depending on what you're printing, you can get away with simply a brush, bottle of ISO, and curing your prints in the sun, at least at first. So if you are thinking about it, grab the machine, try it out. If it's not something for you, you can probably sell it on Kijiji or Facebook Marketplace. And if it is something, then go ahead and invest in a wash and cure station. So I hope you found this video informative. Again, this isn't really a review of the resin printer itself. This is just kind of my initial impressions with my first week of playing with a resin printer. As always, if you do have any questions, make sure you ask them in the comments below. And if you want to help support the channel, the things I do and the content I create, there is links in the description as well. I hope you learned something new today. And as always, have yourself a great day. Thank you.